Welcome to Byju's IAS. We hope you are ready to join us once again on our weekly excursion surveying the events of international relations which are of significance to India's foreign policy, the country's national interest, and are likely to have a major impact on power equation, balance of power, relationship between major powers and in their neighboring regions. What we want to discuss with you this time is an issue which has engaged international relations experts and analysts for a long time, the rise and fall of great powers. And what has started this stream of consciousness in our mind is the state of Britain. Great Britain, as it preferred to call itself, at one time was a major power in international relations. It was an empire on which the sun never set, and slowly over the period of time, its status has diminished. Its power has declined. There are a variety of historical reasons to explain that. The most important was, of course, Britain being depleted of its empire resources during the Second World War and emergence of two superpowers, the United States of America and the then Soviet Union, which were empowered with nuclear weapons, Russia had suffered, as Soviet Union, a major loss of men and material, but it had occupied a major part of Europe and was controlling it. Americans had not suffered as much in terms of men and material. They had decided the course of the war and they had used the atomic weapon to ensure Japan's surrender. These developments were such that which rendered Britain to the margins, along with France and Germany. The interesting part is this, that since the end of the Second World War, there has been a steady decline in Britain's power. It is not even a second-rate power. It is less than a second-rate power. It has the trappings of a major power, is a member of the Security Council, is a member of NATO and Atlantic Alliance, but that has people thinking that can they treat the Great Britain as what it once was. Why we are forced to think along these lines is that the Prime Minister of Great Britain, Boris Johnson, was likely to visit India. The trip was postponed once due to the COVID pandemic. We don't even know for sure, with growing number of cases, whether the visit can achieve what it was intended to achieve. Even if he visits, what would it achieve besides a symbolic trip abroad? The other interesting thing is that Britain seems to be beset with a whole lot of problems at the moment which threaten its description as United Kingdom. Magazines like the respected Economist in London have also started speculating whether the acronym would be Untied Kingdom very soon. And the death of the consort, the Queen's consort, Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh, has again taken our thoughts to Scotland, where Edinburgh is. And then the problem is that how long will monarchy provide the thread which reunites the UK? There have been post-Brexit problems about the backstop in Ireland. There is resentment in Scotland. There is resentment also in Wales. And there are these simmerings of discontent. These circumstances that Britain is trying to organize a COP26 meeting in Glasgow, which will take on the task of arriving at a just, equitable, and of course enforceable within a time frame settlement about the climate change, taking up issues from Paris, which had suffered for past 5 years. So this is one major issue. I think we will have to discuss both things together. What role can Britain play in terms of aspiring major power, or at least a power which can be a useful supporting power for the Americans in the Western alliance system, and what role it can play itself post-Brexit in the climate change negotiations. Let us begin with Ireland. It is ironical that it was the Good Friday Agreement signed in 1998 which had revived the hopes of peace and reconciliation in the strife-torn Northern Ireland and the Irish Republic. And it is around the same time this year when violence broke out in the streets of Belfast and the rioting took place. It could not be controlled for almost a week, and the police people could do no better than to appeal to community leaders to ask young people not to come in the streets, not to be misled by antisocial elements. It is easier said than done to appeal to the community leaders when there is a great divide and rethinking about the validity of the Good Friday Agreement, because questions had been raised about the damage the hard Brexit would do to Good Friday Agreement. At that stage, Boris Johnson, who is always economical with truth, and some say is an outright liar, suggested that he would look after the interest of Ireland, the Northern Ireland, and they would not suffer either in their trade with the rest of Great Britain or with European Union. The Northern Ireland had decided to stay in European Union and had chosen to remain in the customs union and take advantage of the European Union's trade laws, tariff laws, migration laws, etc. But this would be difficult because if Northern Ireland remained a member of the European Union, there was a very real risk of the goods coming out or being exported to European Union being siphoned off, finding their way to the European market, flouting the restrictions which had been imposed by the European Union on Britain after its Brexit. So for a long time, the stumbling block in negotiations had been the Irish backstop, how it would be done. Obviously, there was no land barrier, but what has happened is Boris Johnson has now gone back on that there will be no such barrier, etc., a barrier on the sea. So there is an Irish backstop, not on land, but on sea. The problem again is that he insists that because he has reclaimed the sovereignty of Great Britain, he is not going to accept the standards on food, perishable goods, medicines, etc., which European Union sets a standard on. Even if there is an extension, it has been done more than once, to have a negotiated bureaucratic settlement of what the obstacles might be, Britain's insistence on not adhering to the standards of EU is going to create problems for Ireland also, because the Ireland accepts that. And when this happens, the delay taken in paperwork, even if it is the paperwork, even if there is relaxation of rules for a temporary measure, you cannot A, either continue it for infinity, B, the perishable goods would rot and the cost would be added in any case. So many industries have relocated into European Union, but Ireland at the moment is worse hit because of that. Not that England was not fond. The Irish leaders had made it very clear that if a hard Brexit comes without looking after the interests of Ireland, the Good Friday Agreement would be in jeopardy. Now, before we go to the Good Friday Agreement and the present riots and so on, I think it is necessary for us to take the long historical look at the problem of Ireland. Ireland was annexed, so to speak, in the United Kingdom in 1801 when the Irish Parliament was abolished, and it became a dependent state, so to speak, of the United Kingdom. There has been resentment against this relationship between Ireland and Britain all along. There were rebellions, there was brutal violent suppression, and the Irish people have resented this domination of England over them. What other thing we must never forget is that although all the time the Western countries, including Britain, keep blaming the developing countries in Africa and Asia for communal violence, for communal hatred, and for religious rioting, religious bloodshed, they very carefully and successfully manage to hide what happens in their own backyard. To understand this properly, we must realize that the two parts of Ireland, the Irish Republic is predominantly Roman Catholic, the Northern Ireland is predominantly Protestant. And there has been tension between these two communities and bloodshed all along. In 3 decades of almost a civil war-like situation between Protestants and Roman Catholics in Northern Ireland and in Irish Republic, more than 60,000 people lost their lives. And the Irish Republican Army was behaving like a terrorist group. Sinn Féin was very, very dangerous. Lord Mountbatten lost his life during a vacation in Ireland. But the interesting part is this: there were crimes against humanity and war crimes committed by the British intelligence agents, by the British armed forces, which have been glossed over all along. So Good Friday Agreement was the hope that the IRA will come into the mainstream, Sinn Féin will come into the mainstream, and now peace will prevail and reconciliation will take place. This has been put at risk by the hard Brexit, and there is no denial. There are 2 dominant political groups in Northern Ireland. They are Unionist and Nationalist. The Unionists are those who want to stay with Britain, and Nationalists are those who believe that sooner rather than later, the 2 divided parts of Ireland would be reunited. Now, interestingly, now the communal hatred, the communal animosity between the Protestants and Roman Catholics is far less than it was in the 70s, 80s and 90s till this agreement was signed. Since the turn of the century, the younger generation which has grown up is not so rigid about religious identities, but the economic identities are very important. They hurt employment chances, they jeopardize the profitability of business enterprises, and ultimately these are the grievances which lead to communal conflict. Now, Boris Johnson thought that he would ride the storm, but right now it appears that it is highly unlikely that he will find a solution for this. Interestingly, many of the unionists have changed over to the nationalist side, temperament and inclination now, but at the same time, not many nationalists have started supporting the unionist cause. So what happens is that sooner rather than later, England will be confronted with this challenge of keeping Ireland on its side. The Ireland's problem is that Ireland cannot declare itself reunified and independent and a member of EU because it is surrounded by the sea, and its passage to European Union would still involve complications of checks, tariffs, duties, especially on commodities on which the Britain has different standards and EU has different standards. And if Britain is constrained to accept the European standards of phytosanitary, of medicine, on food grains, foodstuff, poultry, fish, etc., then it would be render Brexit meaningless. His whole justification for winning elections and saying that I would get a hard Brexit, I would get back Britain its independence, sovereignty and glory. Even more threatening is that the Irish resentment and disaffection is apparently having a cascading effect in Scotland. Now, Scotland, of course, again has had resentment with English domination for long, since the days of Queen Elizabeth and Mary, Queen of Scots, and there is a longer history. But Scotland has accepted, it has not been as fiery, as rebellious as the Irish against the English domination, but the Brexit has again forced the people in Scotland who want a separation to revive their demand for independence. Now, there is a complicated arrangement. England had conceded that Scotland can have a referendum, it can choose to stay back in the United Kingdom, it could move out of it, but there is a catch to it. This referendum can only be granted by the British Prime Minister and his consent. Interestingly, what Britain has done, it has got departments of Wales, Department of Scotland, Department of Ireland, and these are in charge of supposedly people, experts who have domain knowledge. Civil servants try to avoid getting mixed up in this, and unless there is a crisis, they don't look at this. In Scotland, the last referendum, by a pretty narrow margin, had decided to stay back in the United Kingdom. But that was before the Brexit. After the Brexit, this gap between those who want to separate and those who want to stay in the United Kingdom has shortened. Now, the interesting part is this: the Scottish party, the Scottish leaders who are pro-independence are asking for the second referendum now. But of course, the British Prime Minister would say we don't allow this. But now the Scottish newspapers have very interesting belligerent statements which say that if Britain doesn't allow a referendum, it is likely that it will have grave consequences. Now, right now there is no rioting like Belfast in Ireland, which is there in Scotland, but the tempers are rising. One complication there is, in Scotland, two pro-independence, pro-referendum parties are at loggerheads with each other. But on this issue, they are one. So one doesn't know how Scotland will take place. The Welsh people were the least aggressive of all three, but they also have been feeling the impact of Brexit, which they think that both Ireland, Scotland and Wales will be reduced to the status of internal colonies, and this arrangement is only going to benefit, if it is at all going to benefit anybody, the England. And also, England would not look at their interest and not prioritize it. So this makes it highly unlikely that Boris Johnson's effort to assume leadership in international diplomacy are going to bear fruit or are likely to succeed. The most important of this, of course, is the Glasgow Summit. We'll come to Glasgow Summit of the Conference of Parties, continuation about the climate change negotiations, but a quick look at what this means for India and United Kingdom relationships. We are members of Commonwealth, we have had close ties, economic, technical, not so strategic in recent past with Great Britain, but when Boris Johnson is having an antagonistic adversarial relationship with not only European Union but also with its constituent units. How much can India depend on personal bonding between the two leaders, the Indian Prime Minister and the British Prime Minister? Can we have a long-term policy planning in context of our relationship with Britain is open to question. The world, it seems, to have woken up suddenly to the threat of climate change. It is not only Boris Johnson who is excited about the Glasgow conference. President Biden has laid great emphasis on a preparatory conference to Glasgow in which 40 nations would participate virtually and express their opinion about what is to be done urgently and their priorities. There has been some resentment and some dissent expressed by smaller countries. There is an association of small countries, 39 countries, tiny nations, which are threatened with extinction. Their survival is at stake if the water level raises and if the temperature of the planet increases even 1.5 degrees centigrade compared to the pre-industrial levels. The target so far had been 2 degrees. It has been impossible to achieve this target, so it was reduced to 1.5, but even 1.5 degrees Celsius would be enough to lead to extinction of small atolls, small island states in Polynesia, Micronesia, elsewhere, and the low-lying areas elsewhere in the world. They think that they do not have the resources to express their views in a virtual space. United Nations has offered them that they can come to its offices and the facilities for virtual conference would be made available to them. But the diplomats and the political leaders of these countries, these very micro states, small minuscule micro states, are very worried that they would be not in a position to defend their interest either individually or as a community of nations when confronted with large nations, big powers like the United States of America, China, Russia, the oil producing countries like Saudi Arabia and the other countries. Some would look with apprehension even to India, but there are about 200 countries, a little more than the member of the United Nations, out of which this is almost 1/4, which has a very grave existential threat. So what would happen to them? But we'll come to that a little later by the time the Conference of Parties takes place. They want physical participations. The United Nations has offered to make available to them the digital means to express their views in a virtual manner, but they are still not very reassured. The greatest emphasis on this renewed climate change negotiations have been put by American president, whose first act was to sign an order saying that America would re-enter the Paris negotiations on environment. But before we examine these things, we should see that he is giving this a reasonable importance. The ex-Secretary of State John Kerry has been appointed the Special Envoy of America for environmental issues, specifically climate change issues, and he has been dispatched not to negotiate virtually, but face to face with his Chinese counterpart to make the Chinese agree to accept the targets for zero carbon emissions. Now there is an interesting thing. The Americans say that they would set a date for the carbon emissions, zero emissions. The Chinese have said that they will achieve zero carbon emission before a certain date. What this zero carbon emission means is that the amount of carbon emitted by a country would be countervailed by carbon sinking, renewable energy uses, and the net result would be a zero carbon emission. If you recall in mind, in an earlier Conference of Parties, certain devious means were argued, accepted, that you would have a carbon exchange. You would do carbon trading, which means that the polluters would continue to pollute and they would put the burden on poor, underdeveloped countries to accept their carbon polluting load and get credits for that. Before we proceed any further, I think it is again useful to take a historical review of the climate change problem. The United Nations came out with the United Nations Framework Convention for Climate Change in 1992. This was full 20 years after the first environmental summit in Stockholm. The issues there were different. In 1972 Stockholm summit, Mrs. Gandhi was the only significant international leader to participate, and she had enunciated the principle that polluters must pay, and she had also come out with the phrase poverty is the greatest polluter, which meant that the countries, the colonial powers, the imperial powers, the large industrialized nations like the United States of America had the primary responsibility for polluting the planet, also carbon emission, which was resulting into heating of the planet. So it was primarily their responsibility to make good what the developing countries had lost, and the developing countries had no option but to use whatever means they had, whatever sovereign control they had over their resources. Maybe it was forests, maybe it was fossil fuels like coal and oil. And she also pointed out over a period of time that people should make a distinction between per capita emission of calculation of carbon emission or creation of polluting things. But for the first 20 years, from 1972 to 1992, climate change was not the priority. It was pollution, it was hazardous waste disposal, it was wetlands, it was biodiversity. Various protocols were signed from Montreal to other things. But when the conference of parties started taking place from 2002, what happened was people were talking about climate change. It had become impossible. The rise in temperature was perceptible. There were extreme weather events which were taking place, forest fires, mudslides, melting of the polar ice cap, permafrost being destroyed. Now, these were things which were having an effect in countries far removed from where this incident was taking place. So people were perforce made to think about it. Their attention shifted from acid rain, silent spring, pollution, hazardous waste to climate change. Unfortunately, the vested interest in fossil fuels tried to denigrate the science of climate change. The oil producers, the gas producers, and larger countries, say for instance earlier Soviet Union, later Russia, part of their power was to sell to others and to control the energy security of Europe through their vast storehouse of gas and petroleum in Siberia. Americans again had ample resources of gas and oil. Canada up north had it, Mexico had it, and Venezuela in Latin America had it. So the American continent was dependent to a large extent on its oil and gas and controlling it. The countries in Gulf, Saudi Arabia, had ever since the discovery of oil in their territory, had enriched themselves and exercised a political clout, strategic significance because of that. So they were not interested in the green option being utilized. They tried to say that this is not science. The validity of climate change science was disputed. They said that it is a stratagem of the enemies or adversaries of the industrialized West to retard their progress. Now, interestingly, one must keep in mind that China and India had a coincidence of interest in this debate. Both are countries with large population. Both, if you calculate the gross emission, they would become as very great polluters. But per capita pollution by Indians or Chinese would be far less than what was in America and elsewhere. It has been said that if you take America and China, they almost account for half the total carbon emission into the atmosphere. That is why Kerry has been sent by Biden as a special emissary to talk to his counterpart. And the optimism there is not without reason, because when Kerry was the Secretary of State in Obama administration and Biden was Vice President, the two of them had collaborated closely with the climate change negotiator nominated by China. So they have talked to each other, they have a degree of trust, and maybe the Chinese have, of course, have entered some caveats. They have said it is not possible to accept deadlines and proportions imposed by somebody else. These should be voluntary. But if every country decides to take a voluntary deadline, a voluntary quota of cutting down carbon emissions, no real progress can be made. The argument with India and China is not only confined to the large number of population or per capita per head emissions, it also is the resources we have. China has large resources of coal, India has large resources of coal, and even if you have non-fossil fuel based energy generation, it has other problems. It may be internal displacement due to big dams. It would be an adverse environmental impact of dams. Countries like Japan have discovered, to their great horror, that even nuclear energy is not clean. It has hazards, either accidental or man-made. So there is this suspicion from Long Island accident to Chernobyl accident to Fukushima accident. So there are no easy options. Now, Indians have in past put a very positive spin, if one may use the word spin, on this, that India has taken a lead in building up the Global Solar Alliance. It has made reasonable progress towards alternative energy generations like wind, geothermal, nuclear as well. But the problem remains that in near future, there is no possibility that nations, especially the developing nations, can give up the option of not using fossil fuels straight away. Now, there are pressures also, like we mentioned earlier. The Russian economic health is largely dependent on the energy trades. Now, what happens is that in past, other options were negotiated. They thought that in foreseeable future, the efficiency of solar energy generation, wind power energy generation would be so accelerated that people would find it possible to give up fossil fuels. So this is one part, but then what China is apparently more willing to accept from Americans, Kerry versus his counterpart in China, the Russians have not been as enthusiastic. When Biden offered a summit to Putin, he said that fine, we have a lot of points on the globe, on the political map, where we are confronting each other, but there are certain global issues where it is necessary for America and Russia to cooperate. The Russians said that, well, if American president calls the Russian president a killer, if he is threatening us by expulsion of our diplomats, interferes in our internal politics by saying how we should treat our political opponents, criticizes us for human rights violation, why should we cooperate with such a person? And how is it that there would be no trust deficit about the commitments made in this field also? This is a point which we must keep in mind. If we recall the earlier parts, we'll see that what were the other major conference of parties. One was Kyoto, where the Kyoto Protocol accepted the principle of differentiated but equitable responsibilities. But this did not quite work out because this led to the way of cheating, using the loopholes, carbon trading, etc. Copenhagen Conference of Parties was again much hyped but failed under its own pressure. There are twofold problems. Problem of the political leadership, the top political leadership, to accept a binding commitment. Voluntary commitment doesn't make any sense. This binding commitment, again, how binding, what will make it binding? So how does one ensure that a binding commitment can be enforced? Now this is a challenge which I think confronts the globalized world entirely. Like the pandemic, the similarity between the pandemic and the climate change issue is this, that pandemic made it very clear to the world that such was the web of interdependence that if one country had an outbreak of an infectious disease, it would travel very fast to all parts of the world, and it is pointless arguing what caused it, who caused it, because the world would have to fight together with the virus and its mutants. It already is leading to vaccine diplomacy, vaccine warfare, vaccine nationalism, which we shall take up at a later stage. Similarly, the climate change, you cannot say that one can only take pity at the plight of the smaller nations whose existence is threatened, but they can't do anything. What applies to microstates also applies to various states in Africa, in Latin America, where they have to take the lead of not their colonial masters, but their neo-colonial masters. They cannot do something. United Nations has provided the framework convention, but it is in no position to see that even its member states, even the permanent members of Security Council, lend their support to this. So this again, the climate change and the pandemic are the two issues which have rendered the third institution of globalization, the World Trade Organization, almost important. So this is likely to continue in near future. We would like you, dear friends, to keep in mind the major landmarks of the climate change negotiations: Trump sabotaging it unilaterally, the Paris Agreement, Biden joining the Paris Agreement, but nobody can make good the 5 lost years. And there are some major countries, some major powers like Russia, for whom this would remain a geopolitical bargaining chip, and they would remain adamant that they would not be a party to a rule-based system made by somebody else. America's insistence on rule-based system doesn't seem to be borne out by its unilateralism in terms of freedom of laws of seas, which is another United Nations laws of seas UNCLOS agreement. So I think there are this complex web of international treaties, interdependence, which the basic problem remains: how do nation states with divergently opposite national interest agree to a minimum common binding program? This is what is the challenge for India and India's climate diplomacy as well. This is all we have for this week. We look forward to meeting you again next week with another set of issues and individuals and events which we can analyze. In the meantime, we would like you to keep in mind that these two issues, the rise and fall of great powers, is not only the superpowers. The relative change in power and status of any major power is likely to create ripples which may turn into waves anywhere else, and the Britain's case shows so. A major power might have internal problems. It may have racial problems, it may have economic problems, it may have subnationalistic alienation. It can happen anywhere. It can happen in the United States, it can happen in China, it can happen in Russia, and we are witnessing this in Britain. We cannot say that India has had no share of these problems of its own, so we must keep this in mind. The problem of subnational identity, the problem of internal law and order and security, the problem of communal violence, which we pointed out that even Ireland is a glaring example of communal violence, rioting and partitioning of the land, which has not led to any lasting solutions. It could be a small country, it could be a big country. On the other side, there are issues which are global issues, which cannot be solved by two major powers agreeing on a binary agreement, bipartisan agreement. It cannot be unilaterally imposed on the whole world. The distribution of power is such, the power equilibrium is such in the world that you have three powers which are important: United States of America, People's Republic of China, and Russia, which have a more or less autonomous role in diplomacy. They have interests, strategic and economic, which can either overlap or conflict with the other two powers. There can be temporary alliances, temporarily coming together of one or the other, but the rest of the world cannot remain a passive spectator. And this is what our situation. We are large enough a country not to become a satellite, not to become a sidekick, not to become a lapdog of any other large country, but our own capacity to influence these global issues at present seems to be limited, so we have to carve out space for ourselves. It is not enough for our environment minister to say that we have made great progress and our ambitions are very high. There should be concrete figures which are shared with the population, one's own population, and there should be a more realistic assessment of one's own power.